Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're doing video, and we have links in the show notes to make it easy to find. And of course, follow us, review us, and join the Patreon. It all helps so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with Katherine Stewart. Katherine has been covering religious nationalism and the assault on American democracy for over 15 years. Her previous book, one of her previous books, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, has won numerous awards, and it was the one that was used as the basis for the documentary God and Country, produced last year by Rob and Michelle Reiner. And her new book, Money, Lies, and God. Again, I'll say it one more time. Money, Lies, and God. The subtitle is Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. It's coming out as we speak. It's so exciting. And I was super honored to be able to read an advanced copy of it. Katherine Stewart, thanks so much for joining us again. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to be in conversation with you.
It really is. It really is. I was so grateful to be able to speak with you in the fall. And I forget if that was before. I think it was right after the election, if I remember correctly. And that was not a great moment. But you know what a great moment for me was when you sent me some music recommendations, Rosetta Tharpe, the electric guitar. So
Uh,
what kind of great music are you listening to these days?
Gosh, I'm sort of a music head. I try to listen to something that I've never heard every day so that I'm always expanding
Oh,
my musical repertoire, that I also always listen to something that I know and love.
oh,
So,
wow. That's a
yeah.
great habit. So, any musicians or composers or anything jump out at you over the last few weeks?
Oh, I mean, gosh, it feels like such a personal question
Sorry.
because it's all right. Music is such a personal kind of thing, and I like all genres.
Yeah.
My mother was a classical musician,
Oh,
and I grew up with music in the house, and but I love all genres. So
yeah.
I've been listening recently to some Ginastera, some Soundgarden, um, some Oliver Schories, if you know who that is, like just really all over the map. I like all kinds of stuff.
Oh man. I was just sharing with Catherine before we hit record that my kid, the middle child, took me to Vegas. He's in the background right now. And on the trip up here, I rediscovered Oscar Peterson. Talk about a
Oh,
great pianist. I mean, he just takes it to a whole other level. So I was really enjoying some of that. So
yeah.
yeah. So much to get into. The book is really eye-opening. It's daunting. I figured I'd start just by asking, you've been writing about the anti-democratic movement for a long time. What first alerted you to the fact that there might be this larger problem?
You know, it all started about 15 years ago. We were living in Santa Barbara, California. Our daughter was attending a public elementary school. She was about 6 years old. And I discovered from another parent that something called a Good News Club was coming to our daughter's school, to our school community. Now, Good News Clubs install themselves inside elementary schools, public elementary schools. They target children in their very earliest years of learning with a message that if they don't believe in their in Jesus, as they explain what Jesus is or means, they're going to go to hell, right? And they try and sort of get these kids to recruit their other 5, 6-year-old peers to the club. They give them often candy and points and prizes for recruiting peers to the club, and and they confuse little children into thinking that their public school endorses a particular form of religion. Now, we're talking little kids here. Kids cannot make a distinction between an activity that takes place in their school and one sponsored by their school. They think if it's in the school, that must be what the school wants them to believe. It has a kind of cloak of authority. So I was kind of, I mean, I don't want to get into the weeds with this story too much, but essentially, I was kind of astonished to discover that this activity had been deemed legal in public schools, um, because of the Establishment Clause, which at one or an earlier time excluded these types of proselytizing activities on public school, in public schools. So I started to really research, who are the people behind the Good News Clubs? What did they really believe? I had our school was in the same district as an evangelical college. All my mom friends were somehow Westmont College affiliated. They were professors or wives of professors. So they were evangelical themselves. They had signed statements of faith, or their spouses had, and yet they didn't want the Good News Club coming to our public school. And that really set off alarm bells. They offered the club free and better space in the church next door to the school, literally next door to the school. And the Good News Club leaders declined. And it was at this, free space, same time, a beautiful facility. And I just thought, why don't they want to be in the church? Why do they need to be in the public school? And how is this legal? And so I started to sort of research the legal strategy that had been promoted by these right-wing legal advocacy groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom or Liberty Council, which are both part of that legal, I would say, Christian nationalist ecosphere.
Hmm.
And I started to recognize that this was a much bigger story than just about a small little Bible club that wanted to come to our local public school. The Good News Club was part of a national organization that was installing thousands of these clubs in elementary public schools nationwide, confusing children as young as 6 and 7 years old, targeting them with books that had no words, just pictures and shapes and colors, books that were intended to convert children who are too young to read. And look, giving kids candy, my 5-year-old, 6-year-old kids, they'll do anything for a cupcake, and they believe in the fairy. So, as I just started to research this, I started to figure out, who is this club? What is their legal strategy? Why are they allied with these big national groups? Who are their alliances? What's the kind of history that kind of, undergirds a program like the Good News Club? And I recognized that, the Good News Clubs were just one part of a larger war on public education. And the war on public education was what one part of a much larger war on the foundations of America as a modern constitutional democracy. So, my work over 15 plus years has grown really organically from my reporting, and Money, Lies, and God is my third book on this topic.
Right, right. I'm imagining you 15 years ago now, entering into that school meeting or discovering, stumbling across that school meeting, and it strikes me that you would have had to have already had a framework, an understanding, as you describe it in the book, the Enlightenment ideals on which the American Republic was founded. So, number one, if you would, could you could you lay out those Enlightenment ideals? But also, I'm curious about you and how you had that context to know, hey, something's not, because not everybody can recite even the First Amendment, let alone the whole Bill of Rights by heart. So how did you already have a context to know something isn't right here?
Well, I mean, I'll just give you an example. Like when you go to a conference of pastors in Virginia, say, and they're suddenly talking about election fraud,
Which, by the
and they're
way, sorry to interrupt, but by the way, one of the remarkable things about your reporting is you like go to all these meetings. It's just fascinating to me how you've been at Moms for everything from Moms for Liberty to the conference that you're describing right now. So sorry to interrupt, but it's really important to point out that you've been on the ground there and you continually go for 15 years now. It's awesome.
Exactly. Well, I've always thought you can't really know what's going on unless you're in the room, right? It's one thing when some of these leaders of this movement, by the way, this is a leadership-driven movement. I refer to the larger movement as, the Christian nationalist movement, or many people call it the Christian right. Sometimes I do as well. But it's not just about the culture wars. It's really about politics. It's not just about these sort of it's not just about abortion or same-sex marriage. It's much, the agenda is much larger. And so, I always thought, it's one thing when these leaders go on CNN or whatever and they're talking, giving their talking points. It's another thing entirely when you go into the rooms where they're talking amongst one another. And there are media that attend a lot of these gatherings. I've been to, Pray Vote Stand, Road to Majority. I've been to, a lot of the pastor gatherings like Faith Wins, Watchmen on the Wall, Church United, and so many others. And then other gatherings of, sort of political, but religion infused political gatherings. And, as I was saying, so when you go to a pastor gathering in Virginia, and all of a sudden they're telling these pastors, the movement leaders are telling pastors, you need to get your congregations to vote their biblical values, and they're giving them voter guides and they're giving them very sophisticated data tools. And then all of a sudden they bring in elections integrity expert and they're talking about election fraud. And then you discover the whole thing is really funded by a kind of California billionaire. And you start to think the story doesn't really fit within a simple frame about, say, white evangelicals or demographic change, for example. So, in my research on Christian nationalism, I've really come to see that we can't talk about Christian nationalist ideology without investigating the role it plays in the political economy. I mean, even back in those early days, it really started to look like one part of this bigger story. And that's how my focus has shifted over time. And then, of course, I've also researched some of the international side of religious nationalism. And I've come to the view that this is not as uniquely American as sometimes we might think it is, this dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. And again, just to go back to, I'd love to just summarize again the Enlightenment. I love how you put it and you described it, the Enlightenment ideals on which the American Republic was founded. So these aren't assumptions that we all share, apparently. So what are some of those Enlightenment ideals?
Well, it's the idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I mean, I think it's really quite simple in that way. We only have to look to our founding documents or some of our founders themselves, people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and Ben Franklin, to understand, if you go into their writings, you understand that they founded America not to serve a religious purpose or to serve a religious leader or a sector of leaderships, but really founded on this idea.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah, I've been
and the idea, of course, is rooted in the concept of equality. All men are, equal. Now, of course, has this principle been, are created equal? Has this principle been carried out perfectly over time? Of course, it hasn't. Back then, of course, the reality on the ground was quite different than it is today. And there had to be almost like a second refounding involving people like Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, who needed to end the, disgraceful 250-year practice of slavery,
right,
but
right.
expanding that idea of equality and underscoring it, and that's been really critical uh, for the success of our nation, for the idea that the arc of the universe bends toward justice.
Bends towards justice, and we're leaning in the right direction. And even then, as you described, the mid 1800s, it took another 100 years before uh, Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, passed the in '64 and then in '65 the right to vote. Things like that.
Women too had to fight for the right to vote. I mean, sort of, you know, uh, we've been able to make progress on so many fronts, but unfortunately, we're facing a movement that really wants to take us in the opposite direction.
Right, right. Yeah, I was going to ask you, in doing this work um, with this program, I've come to learn that there's a significant percentage of the population who just don't want to pursue the idea of e pluribus unum, or however. I'm sorry, my Latin is terrible. But are you overall optimistic or pessimistic? Do I have reason to be concerned that that's the case? I guess if we take the last election, about 51% voted for somebody who's pretty explicitly anti-democratic. But do I have reason to be alarmed, or do you see are you more optimistic than what I've been seeing?
I think we have a lot of reasons to be alarmed. Look, this is a movement that's not hiding. They've been telling us what they're going to do, then they do it. And then they tell us or one another that they did it. I mean, they told us that they were going to smash the institutions that safeguard our democracy. And that's exactly what they are doing now. I mean, many Americans have chosen not to believe what they were saying, but I think we're seeing it play out in front of our eyes right now. And let's be clear, they are not just Donald Trump and Musk, right?
Right. Yeah.
Or even Trump's tiny inner circle. I mean, over the past half century, an anti-democracy movement has really coalesced. It draws on super wealthy funders. It draws on ideologues of the new right, which we can talk about that movement in a bit. It draws on folks who are spreading disinformation and conspiracism. And of course, it draws on Christian nationalist activists. And it pretends to revere the founders and the Constitution, but it fundamentally rejects the idea of America as a pluralistic modern democracy.
Right, right. Now, I appreciated so much of the book because it helped me understand. I think you rightly diagnose a lot of the problem, and you came up with a really helpful label to help us understand the larger anti-democratic movement, and that is reactionary nihilism. So, can you break down what you mean by reactionary nihilism?
Well, I think of nihilism as um, people who want to, nihilists as people who want to destroy rather than create. And it's a description of that fundamental aim to smash things and people by who their actions, rather than necessarily by any declaration, deny that there's any real truth or uh, to the world, or deny that there's any real value to the world.
Right,
And by reactionary, I mean that rather than advance or progress toward a better state, this movement emphasizes a return to some imaginary version of an allegedly better past, right? A past that includes elements of regressive social order, inequality, gender hierarchy, hierarchy based on race, the suppression of certain forms of speech, the attack on religious freedom of those who fail to conform, among other features, the kind of disempowerment of the people, right? So I put those words together, reactionary nihilism, to describe the anti-democratic reaction. Now, let's be clear. Not everybody who wants to go back to the good old days is a nihilist. We all sometimes long for the good old days in one way or another. But here's the thing. Those who believe that a democratic political system and its ideals are so bad that they need to be completely smashed and destroyed, but at the same time are exalting a totally fictitious and unrealistic fantasy about the golden age of yore. I think those people count as nihilists. Their vision is not based on reality. They're retreating into a fantasy that is really projected onto the past.
I it just it's confounding how this how so many of my own neighbors, so many people that I used to go to church with, so many people that I graduated high school with, buy into buy into this mindset. So how does that come about? I mean, it's a multi-pronged effort, but like otherwise good people that I can go and have a coffee with or a beer with or go to my high school reunion with, like how did we get here?
Well, this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, Money, Lies, and God. I hope
Yeah,
you don't mind. So I titled the book Money, Lies, and God because first, money is a huge part of the story,
right.
meaning that huge concentrations of wealth, we've seen like a lot of wealth going to the tippy top of the economic spectrum, and meanwhile, a kind of thinning out among those in I would say, the bottom 90%, where life is getting harder for them. That's the majority of the population. The bottom 90% is struggling more than they used to, whereas people in the top, certainly in the top 1 and 0.1 or 0.1 are just like swimming in in profits and money. So we're talking about the people at the very tippy top. They have a lot more than they used to proportionally to the where the rest of the country is. And that's destabilized the political system in a variety of ways. It's frankly made people all across the political spectrum, including the very wealthy, much more anxious. And we could talk about that a little bit later. So, second, lies is
Mm,
a second part of my book. Lies or conscious disinformation is another huge feature of this movement. And number three, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is Christian nationalism. So, first, again, I pay very close attention to a group I call the funders. These people, again, are beneficiaries of the concentrations of wealth over the past 5 decades. And a sector of very wealthy people are investing, not all, there are a lot of very wealthy people who are trying to sort of restore or sustain democracy or who are not politically engaged at all. But there's a sector of very wealthy people in America who are investing a part of their fortunes in anti-democratic projects. Um, a lot of people, frankly, are going to be hurt if they succeed in destroying a public administration, which is subject to ethics rules, and replace it with a sort of privately controlled corporate managed state. But that's what they want to do. And, I'm thinking about people, I'll just throw out a few names. People like the Corkerys or Barry Side, the Wilkes brothers, or Tim Dunn, or members of the DeVos family juggernaut. There's so many others that I discuss in Money, Lies, and God. But here's the thing. These funders are not any one type. Some are evangelical, some are Catholic, some are Jewish, some are Protestant of various types. Others seem quite atheistic when you really drill into what they believe. Religiously, the point is they're all over the place, but they are, I would say, investing their money in this movement because they want to crush liberalism and what they call the administrative state. So this is sort of where lies fits into the title. There's been this tremendous propaganda campaign against government, right? And we've been hearing it over the years. Who was it who said, I want government so small we can drown in a bathtub? Um,
yeah.
and listen, when Americans are surveyed about government, they always say they come up with ludicrously over, large estimates about waste and fraud. Now, of course, there's waste and fraud. Just in government agencies, just as there is in the private sector, there's always room for improvement. But people need to be reminded of the very good things that government does, along with the very many bad things that happen in countries with kleptocratic and cronyistic governments or those with an absence of effective government. I mean, many Americans are well aware that corporations are really not out to make life better for them necessarily, but to take their money, right? While they are rewarding their people at the tippy top with massive payouts. I mean,
Yeah.
let's look at the health insurance industry. A lot of folks are angry about that, but it's not the only insurance industry that's despised. So we really need some truth telling on that front.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's certainly helpful. The book obviously is great, and I also appreciated was it New York Times that I just read a column that came out. So you're really helping us to diagnose a huge part of the problem. And again, I mentioned this a second ago, but what I was really captured by is that you are the boots on the ground as an investigative journalist. You've attended any number of these rallies. So I was actually curious when you're attending an event, one that I marked down, the Joyful Warriors National Summit. how how do you maintain your composure and stick to your job as a reporter?
I mean, that's not hard at all. It's, because this is what I do. I'm enjoy going to these events, or I wouldn't do it. I find a lot of use. Maybe enjoyment isn't quite the word, but I always find them very useful. So, I mean, let's just talk about Moms for Liberty for a minute.
Okay.
The basic story of Moms for Liberty is they're political activists. The key figures are all Republican operatives. Their goals are national. They don't really have anything to do with liberty. They
Yeah.
aim to destroy public schools in order to pave the way for public funding of private and religious schools or charter schools run by right-wing operatives. And they hope that in the future, religious organizations will be doing this. And you really can't understand that until you go to their conferences. that they're provoking these culture wars in public school and pumping up like things that are really myths, right? Or things that don't exist, at least in the way that they say they do. They're mobilizing the politics of outrage in order to destroy public education. Now, as a reporter, here's why I go. Sometimes it's the small, seemingly irrelevant side conversations that give you the most insight. So I want to tell you a story about a lady I sat next to at a Moms for Liberty breakfast.
Yeah.
She had been sort of involved in the anti-abortion movement in a fairly peripheral way in the past, signed some things and gave some money, but she wasn't super involved in politics. But then, through another activist in her community, she discovered that a book written by Anne Frank called The Diary of a Young Girl was in a public school library. You know the book, right? It's
Yeah.
about
The Diary of Anne Frank.
all
Yeah.
the right. And it was this discovery that frankly put her over the top and got her engaged in Moms for Liberty. And she was upset about this. And I said, so what do you find objectionable about this book? And here's the amazing thing. She said, the lesbian scene.
The lesbian scene.
Exactly. So I struggled to remember a lesbian scene in the book. And frankly, I couldn't because you know what? There isn't one.
There isn't one. I think she
There
talks
isn't one.
about one. There's like being admiring her.
She had a friend, a best friend. At one point, they expressed a little adolescent curiosity about something and wanted to prove their friendship. But the friend later, who managed to survive the war, said this was just friendship and curiosity. There's nothing lesbian about it, right?
Oh my.
So, but the moral of the story is that there are a lot of people drawn into this movement that come from, I would say, uninformed or idiosyncratic takes, and their
Right.
views are often offensive, but they're also disconnected to reality at the same time. So, back to my breakfast companion. Here's a woman whose response to a moving testimonial about the Holocaust is some utterly tangential obsession with the culture war issues that happen to be dominating America's school boards, thanks to groups like Moms for Liberty. Now, if we were to explore her views a little further, we might find in her a fair amount of anti-Semitism and
Mm,
homophobia, but it's not thought out. It's really not sort of explored. She might not think of herself that way, but this movement is very good at tapping into and exploiting this kind of unthinking prejudice.
right. Right. Yeah. I was curious about some of the characters that you come across at Moms for Liberty events and other events that you've attended. This is just one of them. But I would imagine too that there are folks that became very human to you that maybe you developed an affinity for. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Listen, as I've met a lot of people, a lot of these conferences, um, and even formed some friendships. And I think that, events and things like that. And I think that a lot of them are fundamentally good people. They care, love their families. They, care about their neighbors. Many of them really do believe they're doing what's best for our country. But unfortunately, all their good intentions have been sort of drawn in by a movement and exploited by a movement that is dividing our country and destroying democracy at its foundations right now, and demonizing anyone who doesn't happen to agree with their political agenda. Often you hear in, I would say, moderate, liberal, or progressive circles, we need to reach across the political aisle. We need to understand these people and talk to them and find common ground. And that's really nice. Well, where you don't hear that so much is on the other side of the political aisle. You hear a little bit about of that talk, I would say, amongst the some sectors of the pro-life movement who
Yeah.
trying to convert, change hearts and minds. They're trying to convert people to their viewpoint. And they talk about, have calm conversations with people. And, you've got to get them to, you know, recognize that this is about equality. They have like buzzwords that they use to try to persuade people. But when you go to the big conferences, like I was recently at America Fest, which is an annual conference put on by Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk's organization. This is one of the, I would say, you know, key organizations right now. They played a really important role in turning out the vote and pursuing low propensity voters in 2024. You hear a lot of talk about anyone who doesn't agree with them as satanic or demonic, or at a lot of these conferences, there's this idea that we're facing an absolute state of emergency,
Right.
and the consequences of loss in the political arena are too dire to ignore, too dire to ignore and to risk. And so that lays the groundwork for suspending the rules and finding a strong man, putting your
Mm.
faith in a strong man who's going to break the rules and who is a law unto himself. Forget the laws. We need to suspend the laws because democracy is satanic, and we're in battle for our souls, and God is on Donald Trump's side, and he's the savior to our country. It's really sad. I mean, they often compare um, Trump to a king, a biblical king, like
Even a
King.
messiah, like a messianic figure. Yeah.
I know, an imperfect ruler that God chose to, you know, enact his will through him. And here's the thing about kings. Kings aren't kings of democracies.
Mm.
They can do what they want. They break the laws. They are the law unto themselves. And look what's happening right now. I mean, right in front of our eyes. I think a lot of people who voted for Trump didn't really count on the richest man in the world sending his minions to go marauding through Treasury and go after grandma's Social Security checks, cancel
Yeah.
Head Start, cancel food aid for children.
Right,
So,
right. To your point, I don't know if two of my favorite writers, David Brooks and David French, read your book yet, but I have a feeling they may have because they both, in recent columns, mentioned the political philosopher Carl Schmitt, who you deal with in the book. So remind us, it's the friends. I think it was the friends and enemies part of his philosophy that you dealt with in the book. So remind us, who is Carl Schmitt, and how is some of his philosophy showing up in American politics today?
yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I want to say, to set this up, that quite a few people in the new Trump administration are paid up members of the New Right. It's a reactionary intellectual movement. It's not conservative in any intellectual sense, I would say not conservative in a conventional intellectual sense. It's really centered on the Claremont Institute, which is a Southern California think tank,
Right.
and more recently, the Heritage Foundation and the authors of Project 2025, such as Russ Vogt. So many of these new right thinkers are advocating for replacing American democracy with a form of religious authoritarianism. But some of these other members of the new right, their embrace of religious nationalism, frankly, seems performative. They don't seem to believe in anything more than power, and some of them draw their
Mm.
inspiration from the Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt. So
Right.
let's talk about who Schmitt is. He was again the a political theorist from a Nazi political theorist. He had this idea that there's a sort of friend-enemy distinction. You're either with us or you're against us. You're one of the pure versus one of the impure. And that sets the stage for a kind of total dehumanization of people who don't happen to agree with you politically. You know, this idea that, maybe we want the same things. Do we just have different ideas about how to get there? I mean, I think a functioning democracy operates best when we can give some trust to one another with this idea. We all want to uphold democracy. We just might have different ideas about how to bring about these solutions, but that's not where we're at today. Um, the thing about Schmidt is he also came up with this idea that we are in a state of permanent emergency. You know, things are so terrible, we need to take radical action in order to, quote unquote, save us, the true people, the good people. And a lot of these folks are absolutely, obsessed with Schmidt. Um, and here's another thing. The Claremont people are obsessed with Hegel as well,
Mm.
because Leo Strauss, who's another one of their key figures, and Schmidt were also obsessed with Hegel. Schmitt particularly was obsessed with Hegel because he saw him as representative of the relativist liberal ethos
Yeah.
that threatened the greatness of the German people and the German state. Um, so the men of Claremont have sort of when they talk about philosophy, they often talk about Hegel. They've decided that he's going to be their boogeyman, and they make him stand in for what they call historicism and liberalism and wokeism and everything else that they seem to abhor.
What again, confounding. There's so much that's confounding. You mentioning the men of Claremont, and you ask a really good question. Who or what do the men of Claremont really fear? And how does their fear shape the anti-democratic reaction in which they now have a significant role? So, who or what do they fear? I don't understand.
Oh my gosh, so much of it is about Corey, so much of it is about like performative, you know, politics, sort of, big explosions and hey, look at me, I'm doing this, funny thing that, by doing this, funny thing, I'm giving a Nazi salute, but am I really? But that moves the goalposts, right?
Mm,
And, they seem to be defined more about what they want to destroy rather than what they want to create when they talk about what they're after. Well, certainly they're after male supremacy again. But, more than that, they're after a kind of more authoritarian form of politics. Um, it's interesting. I think a lot of autocratic political systems make use of male supremacy in order to, it's funny, I was just talking the other day with a woman who's a friend of mine. She's from a country that has sort of it's like an Islamic fundamentalist
mhm.
um, laws, so the women's freedoms are incredibly restricted. And she said that, she's not living there anymore. And she said, when I was living there, the men they're suppressed. They can't speak freely. They can't engage in political opposition. There's a lot they can't say, a lot they can't do. They can't question their faith. But each man gets to be a little king in his own house because he's so
Mm,
busy controlling his wife and his children and especially the girls and deciding what they can and can't do, that he's distracted. He gets to sort of big himself up by putting women down. So I do think misogyny plays a role in the new politics of the new right, but I think there's something bigger here.
mm.
Authoritarianism, or let's say, to be less polite, fascism, right? I
Yeah.
think it's understood as something that happens to a political system rather than something that starts off as a full-fledged political program that receives majority support. So again, I think they have this sort of fantasy idea of the past, but what's happening is that, I talk about this movement as more pathology than program. What I might mean to say is it has a lot of different pieces and different interest groups, sometimes working for different aims, but nevertheless sort of reinforcing one another. So they're all rowing in the same boat in a sense, but the outcome of their collective actions can really be unpredictable and lead to consequences that many of the rank and file, certainly who are lending support to this movement, don't anticipate and don't want. And even some of the leadership um, will not anticipate and would not want to see at its end state.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's speaking of a pathology, one of the things that helped me understand all of this is something that now Vice President J.D. Vance said is they hate the right people. We're friends with them because they hate the right people. And that's really, it's like a compass that you set for true north. And the true north is, do they hate the right people? And it's anybody outside of, yeah.
I know. I mean, the sad thing is, in an earlier and perhaps more innocent time, we used to think that, it made good sense in politics to work across the political aisle and to try to, find common ground with people who believe differently. But these folks have spent years literally demonizing people who are politically different. And what they're doing is they're sort of downgrading the values, and not just down, like trashing
Mhm.
and they're and viewing with contempt the values of empathy and and kindness.
Right, right.
And,
You know,
and I think yeah, it's really, really kind of disgraceful. I think there are things that democracy relies on in order to really function, a sort of sense of trust in a way in one another, a sense of community care,
Yeah.
a sense of unity and shared purpose that allows people to work with one another despite their political differences. But this is why the number one rule of the authoritarian playbook is to divide the populace. And Mr.
Right.
Trump, of course, is an expert in this department.
Absolutely. And anything that happens, I live in Southern California, and my pastor's house was ruined. It got
I'm
gone.
so
The only thing that's left are the
sorry.
cement steps, and yet somehow he uses one of the first acts as Trump 2.0 was to use a terrible wildfire as a point of division. That day,
Imagine had
as
Biden done the same thing, tied, aid to North Carolina to the
right.
politics of that state. That just would not have happened. I mean, it's also hard to think of another American president who would have taken advantage of an airplane tragedy to push
Oh God.
hateful rhetoric
Yeah.
about DEI.
Yeah.
Now, to be sure, we can look at different policies on DEI, and some of them might need to be reformed in some way. But this administration is launching a total war on anti-discrimination law that has nothing to do with merit and everything to do with stoking division.
Yeah, amen. I have so many more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. I know you're with a book coming out this week. I know that you're very busy. Gosh, I could do a whole other hour, just if not more. But I want to jump to something that you said in the conclusion. Basically, if we consider all of what you're reporting in the book, things look awfully grim. But you seem to have reason to be hopeful. Is that fair? And if so, what are you hopeful about?
Hope is in the actions, right? I'm, neither optimistic nor pessimistic, as Stacey Abrams, I think, said. I am determined. And I think once you get involved in any kind of democracy building initiatives, that is what gives you hope. Other people give you hope, And so I do think it's not a time for us to like crawl into bed and pull the covers up. That's not what they did in 2020, by the way, when they lost an election. Now, we wouldn't want to launch a violent attack on a capital or anywhere. We don't, I think it's, we don't engage in violence. We would not want to spread lies or emulate their most craven tactics, but they also turned out their vote. They focused on going after low propensity voters. They bolstered the organizations that form the infrastructure of their movement. So there are no shortage of avenues for positive engagement. I think it's really important to work locally. People often ask me, what should I do? I think, get involved in sort of local stuff, find democracy building organizations that resonate with you. Do a bit of research. When
Mm.
you go buy a winter coat or who knows, a bed or a new lamp, you do some research. You don't just, you know, wait for someone to tell you what to do. You go out and figure out what's out there and you figure out what's right for you. So I think it's really important that we all get active and find our lanes.
Absolutely. Again, the book is Money, Lies, and God. And I'm not going to give it away. You really have to get it. Really have to read it. It's a great diagnosis, but also there's a prescription. I'm not going to give it all away, but I will give a few bullet points just to sum it up and drive home the point. Number one, six principal findings that reported in the book. Anybody who's interested in this pro-democracy coalition, we are in the majority. People who love democracy are in the majority. Don't be fooled. And in the anti-democracy movement, they're divided. You also say that separation of church and state, it's a good idea. It's right there in the First Amendment, that tension between the Establishment Clause and the freedom of to practice your religion. It's right there in the First Amendment. Extreme levels of material inequality are eroding democracy. Knowledge is power, and organization matters. I really, really love the book. I'm not gonna. Do you want to ask me a question? I feel like I'm rushing to be respectful of your time, but you can ask me a question if you like, or we could skip it for the next time.
Let's do it the next time. I'd love to join you again in conversation. This has just been so much fun, and really thank you for the work you're doing. It's important.
Absolutely, absolutely. I will ask the one last question, which is the TPNR question. We asked it last time, but I want to know how your thinking has evolved since you're actively reporting, actively investigating. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, and perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So people have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
Well, I think it's always worth trying. I think listening in general is underrated. That's just, when I go to these events and I'm reporting, I try and, frankly, keep my mouth shut and my ears open.
That's great. Yeah, Monty Guzman would approve. I never the she's coming on the show again in a few weeks, and she wrote that great book a couple of years ago called "I Never Thought of It That Way." And her movement is about just radical curiosity, which I think you really have and display here. So, Monty God, thank you so much for coming back on, Catherine. It's great to see you again, and thanks for doing all you do. Before we go, how can folks find the book and follow all the great work that you're doing?
Thank you so much. Money, Lies, and God is sold everywhere books are sold. And some of my work is archived on my website, which is katherinestewart.me. And I have a piece in this past week's New York Times op-ed, which you're welcome to look up. And thank you so much. It's been really terrific to be in conversation with you.
Terrific. KatherineStewart.me. Thanks so much for doing this again. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited about the book coming out, and hope that we do it again real soon.
Me too. Thank you so much.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing, remember to follow the show, write that review, and watch the conversations on YouTube. It's youtube.com/@politicsandreligion. Check it all out. Get some TPNR swag. Your support really does make a difference. Thank you for all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion without killing each other and with gentleness and respect. And have a great one.